Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Paul and with the Dicey Review, and today we're going to be learning how to play the 1 to 4 player game Wayfarers of the South Tigris, being released by Garphill Games. Now, in Wayfarers of the South Tigris, you and up to 3 other players take on the role of explorers and astronomers and cartographers, exploring the landscape starting out in Baghdad. You have to cleverly manage your equipment and your helpers to make sure that you explore most efficiently and report back regularly to the House of Wisdom. How does the game play? Well, let's get to the table and find out. Wayfarers of the South Tigris comes with all of the components that you see here, including 36 space cards, 4 double-sided player boards, 12 total workers in 3 different colors, 16 inspiration cards, 36 land cards, 36 water cards, 3 double-sided main game board sections, 36 Townsfolk cards, 6 scheme cards for solo play, 48 silver tokens, 48 provision tokens, player components in 4 different colors, 62 total upgrade tiles in different colors and sizes, and 10 journal tiles. To begin setup, start by placing the 3 sections of the game board face up in the middle of the table. Each of these sections is double-sided, and you can use either side when setting up the game to create some variability between plays. Next, shuffle the different card decks into separate face-down stacks and place them near the board in the indicated spaces. Then, turn over 4 cards from the top of each deck and place them along the board in the indicated spaces like shown. Then, shuffle the 10 journal tiles and place them face up onto these spaces of the main board. Then, take the 4 green workers and place them on these spaces of the main board as well. Then, take the 10 special pink upgrade tiles and place them on their 10 matching spaces of the main board. Then, for the remaining types of upgrade tiles, take 1 each per player in the game and place them on their indicated spaces of the main board. So for instance, in our game, we're going to be playing with 2 players, so we would place 2 each of the green, yellow, blue, and black upgrade tiles. Then create a supply of silver and provision tokens near the main game board. Each player would then be given a player board dealt at random, and the dice of their player color, 3 of which they'll keep, and 2 of which will be placed on the main game board near the minarets. These dice can be earned later during the game. The dice that are kept will be rolled by the players and then kept near their player board. Each player will also receive 15 influence markers in their player color, 1 blue and yellow worker each, and a player marker in their chosen player color, which will be placed in the first space of the journal track on the main board. Then you'll randomly decide a first player, and then each player will receive an amount of starting provisions and silver, depending on where they are in player order and the number of players. This chart can be found in the back of the rulebook. And then each player will also receive influence in one of the 3 guilds, depending on the player count as well. The first player would receive 1 influence in the blue guild, and the second player would receive 1 influence in each, the blue and yellow guild. After this setup is done, you're ready to play. In Wayfarers of the South Tigris, players take on the role of explorers, cartographers, and astronomers who are trying to map the circumference of the world starting out from Baghdad. During the game, players will take actions to gather land and water cards, which will go to the left and right of their player boards. They'll also have the opportunity to gain space cards, which will go above their land and water cards. And they'll have the opportunity to hire helpers that can increase the effectiveness of their different water and land cards as well. Players will also have the opportunity during the game to journal, which will allow them to move along this track and give them certain benefits throughout the game. The first player to reach one of the 5 ending spaces on the journal board will trigger the end of the game. Players will also have the ability to gain influence with one of 3 different guilds throughout the game, and by removing some of this influence on their turn, players can trigger powerful abilities as well. Beginning with the start player, and then going in clockwise order, a player will take 1 action on their turn. Players will continue to do this until the game end is triggered. And on their turn, players have a choice of one of 3 actions. They can either place a die, place a worker, or rest. We'll first look at placing a die. When a player places a die on their turn, they'll place one of the available dice that they have in their area on one of the available dice action spaces in their player area. At the start of the game, each player has 6 available spaces to place a die, indicated by these white squares. As players gain new cards throughout the game, they may increase their options for dice placement locations by expanding their player tableau. Some dice placement locations will be blank and have no symbols in the middle. A die of any number can be placed in one of these locations to take an action. Some dice placement locations, however, will have a symbol in the middle like you can see here. To be able to place a die in one of these placement locations, you have to have the particular asset required by that dice placement location. For instance, this particular location requires a telescope, whereas this particular location requires a camel. The assets that each of your dice may have will be represented by this grid at the top of your player board. Each die in the game is represented on this grid, and any asset symbols underneath a particular die on that die's column will indicate which assets that die has. Dice can also have discounts or special abilities, which we'll go into in more detail when we talk about upgrade tiles. At the start of the game, each player has one camel asset associated with their number 1 die, and one telescope asset associated with their number 6 die. This means that the players could place any number 1 die on a space that requires a camel asset. This is once again because each player starts with a camel asset given to them underneath their 1 die. So for instance, if a player wanted to go to this location where they would have to pay 2 provisions to gain a land card and a coin, they could do that with a 1 in their supply. In a similar way, if a player would rather go to this location that required a telescope asset, they could do so if they had a 6. That's because every player's 6 dice start with a telescope asset given to them on their player board. Once again, players will be able to get upgrade tiles throughout the game that give their other dice different assets or give them special abilities, and we'll look at that in more detail when we talk about upgrade tiles. For now, let's say that this player wanted to use their 1 to go to this space because their 1 has a camel asset that's required. This would then allow this player to take this action. Most of the actions in the game will rely on certain iconography to tell you what they do, but most of the iconography will follow the same type of pattern. For instance, anytime you see a plus with a particular card type, that means you have the ability to gain that type of card. This action would allow you to gain a land card, this action would allow you to gain a water card, this action would allow you to gain either a space card or a black upgrade tile. This action would allow you to gain a Townsfolk card, which is represented by green, etc. In this example, this player is taking this action by placing their 1 in this location. This action would require the player to spend 2 provisions, and then they would be able to gain 1 land card and 1 coin. They could first gain the coin by placing it in their supply, and then they would have the ability to gain a land card. Whenever players are gaining a land card, they could either pick from one of the 4 face-up land cards, or if they wanted to, they could draw 3 from the top of the stack and pick 1. There's a reminder on the back of each land and water card that this is always an option when gaining a land or water card. To be able to draw 3 and pick 1, a player would either have to spend 1 provision, or they would have to have an available pigeon asset to be able to take this option. Let's say in this example the players just want to take one of the 4 face-up cards. Land cards will typically come in one of 2 main types. There will either be city land cards, which will give a player another dice placement location where they can go take an action, or there will be vista land cards that are indicated by this symbol, which will give players some type of a benefit whenever a certain action or condition is met. In addition to that, many land cards will also have some type of an immediate bonus indicated by this lightning bolt that will give players a one-time ability when they gain the card. For instance, if a player were to take this card, they would immediately gain a coin. If they were to take this card, they would immediately be able to add 1 influence marker to the yellow guild. If a player were to gain this card, they would immediately be able to refresh a die, which will allow them to either re-roll a die that they have in their supply, or take a die from a spot where it's already assigned, re-roll it, and add it back to their supply as well. We'll say that this player wants to gain this land card on the left. When a player gains a land card, they'll always be placed to the left of their player board and will extend this landscape here. Since this player took this card, they would immediately gain the benefit and be able to refresh one die like we just stated. The player could either re-roll one of the dice in their pool, or they could remove the die they just placed, re-roll it, and then add that die to their supply to use on future turns. In addition, this player now has an ongoing ability from this Vista card indicated on the bottom of the card here. This ability says that anytime a player gains a Vista tag, whether it be on a new card or an upgrade tile, etc., they would gain 1 coin. And it's important to note that players can never gain the benefit of Vistas in the same turn that they acquire them, so the player wouldn't gain a coin even though this card that they acquired was a Vista itself. Many of the abilities and scoring opportunities in this game are based off of what the game refers to as tags, which are the symbols on cards or game pieces. There are 4 main tags in the game: the vistas, the cities, the harbors, and the open water symbols, as well as a number of other symbols that may relate to scoring opportunities or other cards or actions, like this observatory symbol or book symbol. The back of the rulebook provides a very helpful guide to all the different icons and what they mean, and many of the game's icons will share similarities. Some of these symbols will also be visible on cards and will give you an indication that the card may benefit you in a certain type of action. For instance, these 2 city cards have a subtype of an observatory or a book symbol as well. This sub-symbol on this card will give you an indicator that the action on the card will either help you with space cards or upgrade tiles, as you can see by the bottom of the card. And it's also important to note that some cards may require multiple assets from the same die, as you can see here. We'll talk more about how to get multiple assets on one die whenever we talk about upgrade tiles in the future. Cards that have the library subtype will indicate that they're helpful if a player wants to try and journal. We'll talk more about journaling in detail in a moment. All of these symbols and tags may be important in in-game scoring, and we'll go into that in detail at the end of the video. After this player has acquired this land card, placed it, and gained any immediate benefits, they would then fill in the empty space in the card row. If applicable, they would first slide any cards to the right to fill in any empty spaces, and then turn over a new card from the stack to fill in the leftmost space. If a player wanted to acquire a water card, they would have to come to this location with a die showing a boat asset. At the start of the game, players don't have any dice on their starting grid with a boat asset. However, players can use one of their guild influence to help with this. Having influence in one of the 3 guilds will help in a number of different ways. At the end of the game, players can score points for having the most influence in each of the guilds, and on each of their turns, players can use at most 1 influence from each guild to use a special ability on their turn. We'll go into more detail about the yellow and black guilds' abilities later in the video, but the blue guild's ability would be very helpful on the light blue player's turn. If a player removes 1 influence from the blue guild, they can treat any die as if it has a boat asset. So this player could remove this blue influence marker, place it back in their supply, and then choose any of their dice and place it as if it has a boat asset. So in this instance, they'll say that this 2 has a boat asset because they removed that influence from the blue guild. Gaining a water card will work in a very similar way to gaining a land card. The player would first pay 2 provisions to the supply, and then they would be able to select a water card from the display. When selecting a water card, just like the land cards, players can select any one of the face-up cards, or they can pay an extra provision or use an unused pigeon asset to draw 3 from the top of the pile and keep 1. Water cards will come in one of 2 types, either a harbor card or an open water card. Harbor cards will give a dice placement location just like the city cards, and open water cards would give players a one-time powerful ability that they could take. We'll say that this player decides to take this open water card. Water cards, when gained, have to be placed to the right of a player's player board, continuing the water landscape. One thing that's different about placing a water card is players will be able to unlock one-time abilities by what the game calls connection links. If you look at these icons on your starting player board and the icons that are continued on further water cards, there will be symbols for potential bonuses that can be gained when placing a new water card. For every connection link that you see, where you're able to connect a lightning bolt to a bonus icon, you would get that bonus when placing the card. So for instance, by placing this particular card, this player would gain 1 provision right away. If the player had placed this card, for example, if the player had placed this card instead, they would be able to gain 1 coin immediately and then be able to place 1 influence on an available card. We'll look at placing influence on cards more later in the video. But in this example, the player would gain their 1 provision from the supply, and then they would gain the immediate benefit on the bottom of the card. After the player is done and has placed their water card, they would then fill in the display, first by filling in empty spaces, and then flipping over a new card from the stack. Just like many of the actions, many of the rewards listed that you'll get from immediate benefits follow a set of iconography. Many of the icons in the game have a similar effect. For instance, this immediate benefit would allow you to gain a blue upgrade tile with a discount. You can tell that it has a discount because there are 3 coins with an X showing to the right of it. For instance, this action at the bottom of the player board would allow a player to get a green upgrade tile, but there's no coins with an X, so to get this action, the player would have to pay the full cost when acquiring the green upgrade tile. Players can acquire upgrade tiles in a number of different ways throughout the game. They can acquire them by taking actions like you see here. They can acquire them as instant benefits from cards and different spaces on the journal track. Players can also acquire upgrade tiles by taking certain actions with workers. For instance, by placing a worker at this space, which we'll look at in more detail in a moment, the player would have the ability to acquire a yellow upgrade tile. Most of the time there will be a cost associated with acquiring an upgrade tile. For instance, when acquiring a blue upgrade tile without a bonus or a benefit, the player would either have to remove 2 blue influence or pay 3 coins. In a similar fashion, to acquire a yellow upgrade tile, a player would either have to pay 3 coins or remove 2 yellow influence. To gain a black upgrade tile, a player would have to once again pay 3 coins or remove 2 black influence, and normally to acquire a green upgrade tile, players would have to pay 2 coins. Pink upgrade tiles can only be gained as benefits on the journal track, and those are a bit of a special situation. When a player acquires an upgrade tile, they can place it on any of the open spaces within their grid. Tiles can be flipped one direction or the other, so for instance this tile could be placed this way or this way, but tiles have to maintain their correct orientation, so for instance this tile couldn't be placed this way. And in a similar fashion, this tile can't be placed this way. It has to be placed vertically to maintain the correct symbol orientation. When players place an upgrade tile in their grid, they'll gain a bonus for any of the symbols that they cover within their grid. So for instance, if the player were to place this tile here, they would gain 1 free provision, and then they would be able to move an influence marker from one guild to another. If the player placed their tile here, they would immediately get to refresh 1 die, and then they would gain 1 provision. If they placed it over here, they would gain 1 influence on a card, etc. Upgrade tiles can be placed in certain combinations to make it to where 1 die has more than 1 asset available when placing that die. For instance, in this particular setup, this player's 5 has 2 boat assets. That means that if there's an action that requires more than 1 boat asset, this player could meet that requirement by placing a 5. As you can see, there are some card locations that require 2 boat assets on the same die. And in this situation, this player's 6 has a telescope, camel, and pigeon asset all on the same die. So on a future turn, if they wanted to, a player could place one of their 6s on this location to take the action, to gain a land card and retrieve a worker, and they would then have a leftover pigeon on that die that they could use to draw 3 land cards and keep 1 if they wanted to. It's also important to note that some upgrade tiles will provide discounts if you're using a die to take a certain action. So for instance, if this player uses one of their 3s to take an action, and that action requires a coin, they would get a discount of 1 coin for that action. For instance, if the player placed this 3 to go and gain a green upgrade tile, normally green upgrade tiles cost 2 coins, but since they're using this die that has a discount, it would only cost them 1 coin. It's important to note that discounts can stack. So for instance, on this 2, the player could receive a discount of 1 coin and 1 provision if they use a 2 to take an action. And it's also important to note that some upgrade tiles will provide players the ability to change their dice. For instance, this player's 3 has an upgrade that will allow it to increase a die's value by 1. So for instance, if this player had a 3, they could then change that 3 to a 4. The player also has upgrades on their 4 column, which allow them to upgrade dice even more. They could chain that if they wanted to increase their 4 to a 5. And then they could also increase that 5 to a 6, since they have an upgrade tile showing a plus symbol with a die on their 5 column as well. It's important to note, however, that even though dice manipulation upgrades can chain, they can't stack. So for instance, a player could change their 3 to a 4 and then their 4 to a 5. They couldn't, however, change their 4 to a 6 if this weren't here. Even though they have 2 plus symbols on the same column, these upgrades can't stack, they can only chain. And finally, dice manipulation values can't wrap around. So for instance, this 6 wouldn't be able to be changed to a 1, so a player wouldn't want to place this upgrade tile in this particular way. This is also helpful to know when looking at the yellow guild's ability. If a player removes 1 influence from the yellow guild, they get to increase or decrease the value of dice in their supply by 2. This can be split up in any way the player wants among any number of dice. So for instance, the player could increase or decrease the value of 2 of their dice by 1, or they could increase or decrease the value of 1 of their dice by 2. But as we just stated, a player couldn't change a 5 to a 1 because once again, dice values can't be wrapped whenever you're manipulating the value of dice. And upgrade tiles are limited in the game, so if a player decides to take this upgrade tile, for instance, this particular upgrade tile can no longer be acquired during the current game. Now that we've talked about acquiring land and water cards and some of the upgrade tiles, let's look at acquiring Townsfolk cards. If a player places a die on this action space, they could either acquire 1 Townsfolk card or acquire 2 provisions. A player could select any one of the 4 face-up Townsfolk cards to acquire. After acquiring a Townsfolk card, the players would shift any cards to the right to fill in any gaps, and then place a new Townsfolk card in the leftmost space from the top of the deck. There are a couple of things to keep in mind when acquiring Townsfolk cards. Townsfolk cards will cost a certain number of coins as depicted on the top left of the card. So for instance, to acquire this card it would cost 2 coins. Townsfolk cards also have to be placed underneath particular card types. For instance, this Townsfolk card can only be placed underneath a harbor, whereas this Townsfolk card can only be placed underneath an open water card. There are also townsfolk that need to be placed underneath cities or vistas. Townsfolk cards can be very helpful, however, because whenever they're placed underneath a card, it powers up the particular action of that card, or gives you benefits during a rest phase, which we can look at later. For instance, if a player placed this particular Townsfolk card underneath this card, every time they placed a die here taking this action, in addition to gaining an influence in both of the blue and black guilds and gaining a provision, it would also be able to select one of the rewards from this Townsfolk card, placing an influence on a card, moving an influence from one guild to another, or increasing or decreasing the value of one of their dice. There are also certain Townsfolk cards that will provide assets needed for a particular action. So for instance, this player doesn't currently have any dice on their upgrade grid that has 2 boat assets, but this Townsfolk card provides 2 assets for this particular action. So essentially a player could place any die here because the assets are provided by this Townsfolk card. In our particular example, however, we're going to say that this player selects this Townsfolk card, which gives them an additional benefit whenever they take a rest action, which we'll look at in more detail in just a moment. Now that we've looked at Townsfolk, land, and water cards, we'll briefly talk about space cards. If this player used this 6 to go to this location, they would be able to go there because their 6s have a telescope asset, and this action would allow a player to either gain a black upgrade tile or gain a space card. When acquiring a space card, players can pick any one of the 4 face-up space cards, just like with Townsfolk cards. The cost to acquire a space card will be indicated underneath the particular slot where the space card is. For instance, acquiring this space card would cost 3 coins, this card would cost 4, 4, and 5. Space cards have to be placed above land or water cards. They can never be placed by themselves. So for instance, this space card could be placed right here above this land card. Some space cards will also have an immediate benefit that the players get when placing this card right away. In this example, this player would be able to place 1 influence in the blue guild. If they were to place this space card, this would allow them to gain a Townsfolk card immediately for free. Space cards will provide players with end-game scoring possibilities. For instance, this card will give the players at the end of the game 1 point plus a point for every space tag they have on their player area. The card provides one tag itself. It's also important to note that players start the game with one space card already on their board. This card is above their starting water card. This starting space card would give every player one victory point at the end of the game for every pair of Townsfolk cards and upgrade tiles they have in their area. If a player were to have instead picked this card would give them 1 point for every complete set of land, water, townsfolk, and space cards that they have at the end of the game. Almost all of the space cards will work in a similar way, giving you points for particular combinations of things or tags in your player area. There are two particular examples that I want to point out, however. The first are comet cards. If a player acquires a comet card, it's worth the face value in the top left at the end of the game. If, however, a player has the most comet tags in their player area at the end of the game, each of these cards will be worth 4 victory points instead of the value printed in their top left corner. So in this example, this player has 5 comet tags, and they could potentially get more from acquiring pink upgrade tiles later in the game. At the end of the game, if 5 comet tags gave them the most, both of these cards would be worth 4 points instead of the listed 2 or 1 point value. The other special example that I want to point out are the Sun and the Moon space cards. These cards are worth 3 points by themselves, but if a player is able to collect both the Sun and the Moon card, both of these cards are worth 7 points instead of the listed 3. And the player's starting player boards will have cards printed on them as well, which is important to note when looking at cards like this for in-game scoring purposes. For instance, this would be counted as a space card and this would be counted as a land card, but these pre-printed cards right here would also be counted during in-game scoring. Now that we've talked about acquiring land, water, townsfolk, and space cards, I want to mention journaling. If this particular player were to place a 4 on this space right here, they can do so because they have a pigeon asset on their 4s. They would be able to either remove a worker and gain an influence in any color, or they would be able to journal, which is shown by this symbol, showing an ink pot and quill. When a player takes a journaling action, it allows them to move their player marker along this journaling track. Players start off in this middle section and they can choose which direction to go whenever they first start journaling. For instance, this player could go along to this bottom side and land in this square. If a player wanted to continue along this track, they would have to go in one of the 2 directions connected to the square where they currently are. So for instance, if they wanted to pass into this zone, they could go here or here. And if they wanted to progress from this section, they could either go in this space right here as it's connected, or they could go along this path in the middle. When a player lands on a particular zone while they journal, they would gain the rewards listed in that particular square. So in this instance, this player would gain a green upgrade tile with a discount of 2 coins. If a player is the first to land in one of the squares adjacent to one of the green workers, they would also collect that green worker and place it in their area. A player's first step along the journaling path has no requirements for passing into the next zone, but to be able to progress further along the journaling track, players will have to meet certain requirements that can be seen on these particular ink splotches. For instance, to travel from this zone into this next zone, the player would have to have 1 open water tag in their player area, either on a card or on a tile. If a player wanted to move from here across to this zone, they would have to have 2 townsfolk cards, or if they wanted to move across this particular ink splotch, they would have to have 2 space cards showing this particular star symbol. Players may also have to pay influence when moving across certain journaling spaces. For instance, when crossing this particular journaling space, the player would have to remove 1 black influence from the Black Guild. If the player isn't able to do this, they wouldn't be able to journal further. Players can also utilize the Black Guild's ability to be able to move 1 extra space when journaling. By default, a player is able to move 1 space when taking a journaling action. If, however, a player removes an influence from the Black Guild and uses that guild's special ability during their turn, they can move a 2nd space when taking a journaling action. So for instance, in this example, this player could move this 1 space, they would still gain the green worker if that worker were still there, and then they would gain this reward. And after removing their influence marker from the Black Guild zone, they would then be able to journal a 2nd time and move to the following space, depending on which direction they choose. This is assuming, once again, that they've met the requirements to be able to pass these particular ink splotches into the next journaling region. Most of the rewards gained when players land in a particular journaling zone will match the other iconography in the game. For instance, if a player lands here, once again they could get a free green upgrade tile. If a player lands here, they would gain a provision and a coin, and if a player lands here, they would place 2 influence in the blue guild. There are 2 particular rewards that I want to highlight, however, as they're somewhat different than the icons that we've looked at previously. If a player were to land in this zone, they would immediately be able to gain 1 of the purple upgrade tiles. These particular upgrade tiles will provide players with a number of victory points at the end of the game. For instance, this tile is worth 5 points, this tile is worth 3 points. But in addition to that, they'll also provide players with additional tags that may benefit them depending on what type of space cards or Vista cards they might have. For instance, if a player has the Vista card that gives them a reward every time they gain a Vista tag, this particular upgrade tile would trigger that ability for that player, and it would provide them an extra victory point at the end of the game. Other than that, these tiles can be placed using the exact same rules that we've talked about earlier when placing upgrade tiles. The other space that looks slightly different will be this space right here. If a player lands on one of these spaces in the journaling track, they would be able to gain 1 of their dice that was set aside at the start of the game and roll it into their supply, giving this player 4 dice moving forward instead of their starting 3. And in addition, they would be able to gain an inspiration card. When a player has the opportunity to gain an inspiration card, they can either take one of the face-up inspiration cards from the display, or if they don't like the options that are available in the display, they can also discard one of the inspiration cards to take the worker placement action in the spot where the inspiration card is. We're going to look at worker placement actions in detail in just a moment, but as an example, if a player wanted to, they could discard one of these cards to either gain 2 coins, gain a coin and refresh 1 die, gain a provision and gain 1 influence in any color, or gain 2 provisions. Let's say, however, that this player decides to take this inspiration card. When a player takes an inspiration card, it has to be tucked behind one of their space cards. This can be either the starting space cards that players have pre-printed on their board, or one of the space cards that they can gain throughout the game. Each inspiration card will show some type of condition that, if met, will double the scoring possibility of the card that it's under. So for instance, normally this card would give a player 1 point for every pair of a Townsfolk card and an upgrade tile that they have. If, however, a player collects this inspiration card and is able to get 4 of these open water tags in their player area before game's end, that scoring would be doubled, so this player would gain 2 points for every pair of these 2 things, if the player is able to meet this inspiration condition before the game is up. The types of inspiration cards will vary, but usually there'll be some form of this type of condition. For instance, 5 of these particular tags or 3 of these particular upgrade tiles. After gaining the inspiration card or discarding it for its effect, the players would slide down any inspiration cards and replace them from the top of the deck. Now that we've talked about gaining all of the different card types and moving along the journaling track, it's time to briefly mention placing workers and some of the interactions that come with that. There are 16 worker placement spots around the board, and instead of placing a die on your turn, a player could place a worker. Workers are placed directly on cards. When a worker is placed on a card, the player will receive the bonus depicted above the card, wherever the card is in its particular slot. It's also important to note that worker placement spots or cards require certain colors of workers. For instance, this spot requires a blue or a green worker. And it's important to note that each card can hold a number of workers equal to the colors accepted at that location, meaning that on this location, a blue worker can be placed and then a green worker. That's because this spot accepts both blue and green workers. If, however, a player then placed a green worker on this location, that card would be full and couldn't hold any more workers until they were cleared or removed. These card locations can hold either a green or a yellow worker, and once again, each card can hold 1 green and 1 yellow worker, so a total of 2 workers can be placed on each of these locations. Each of the worker placement locations along the inspiration card side of the board can hold 3 workers, 1 green, 1 blue, and 1 yellow. You can also place workers along the top edge of the board on the Townsfolk cards, but each of these locations can only hold 1 worker, and the worker has to be green. Each of the actions that you can take whenever placing a worker will relate to the same type of iconography that you see when placing a die. For instance, if you place a worker here, you can journal and then gain a provision. If you place a worker here, you can gain a green upgrade tile with a discount of 2 coins. If you place a worker here, you get to place 1 influence in all 3 guilds. And if you place a worker here, you get to acquire a space card with a discount of 1 coin. Players can also take the action to draw 3 cards and keep 1 by placing a worker in this particular location and paying 3 provisions. If a player were to place a worker here, they could refresh 1 die and then increase or decrease the value of 2 dice. There are some cards, like this Vista card for example, that allow you to gain a worker into your supply by grabbing them from a card. For instance, with this particular Vista card, every time a player puts an observatory or library tag onto their player area, they're able to remove a worker from a card. So for instance, if a player were to acquire this particular tag during their turn, they could take this worker and place it in their supply. It's important to note, however, that whenever you gain a worker, it can only be taken from a card. It can't be taken from another player's supply. It's also important to note that if a player ever acquires a card, so for instance, if a player took this water card, they would get any workers that are on the card when they take it. Players are never allowed under any circumstance, however, to gain a card that contains a worker that they've just placed. Players also have the ability to place influence on cards throughout the game. For instance, if a player were to cover this space of their upgrade grid, they would immediately get to place an influence on a card. A player can only place an influence on a card where there's not already an influence. So for instance, this yellow player, if they wanted to, could place that influence on that card. Once an influence is placed on a card, anytime someone interacts with that card, they would have to pay the player who put the influence 1 coin or 1 provision. So for instance, anytime someone were to place a worker on this card, remove a worker from this card, or gain this card, they would have to pay the yellow player 1 coin or 1 provision to be able to do any of those things. If a player can't pay this influence, they can't interact with that card. The last action that a player can take on their turn is to rest. Players can rest no matter how many dice they have available in their supply. So for instance, a player could rest with 3 dice available. However, if a player rests when they only have 0 or 1 dice available in their pool, they'll get bonuses during this phase. When resting, the player would take all of the dice that's been placed on their board previously and roll them into their supply. If they have any dice remaining in their supply that haven't been placed, they can keep that die with its same value or roll it if they want to at this time. Then the player can gain any of their resting abilities below their player area in any order. For instance, since this player only had 1 die in their supply, they can activate this ability by journaling and gaining a coin, and then activate this ability gaining 2 coins. Or they could have activated them in the reverse order. The end of the game is triggered as soon as someone moves into one of these final 5 spaces of the main board on the journal track. After this end game is triggered, every player, including the player who just triggered the end of the game, will take 1 final turn, and then scoring will take place. At the end of the game, players will first score for the 4 main sets in the game: the cities, vistas, harbors, and open water tags. For each individual tag, a player will score points based on how many of that particular tag they have. For instance, for vistas and cities, this player only has 1 of each. So since they don't have 2 of either of those tags, they don't score any points for vistas or cities. They would then score harbors and open waters, however. This player has 3 total harbor tags, 1 on their upgrade grid, a 2nd and 3rd in their player area. Since they have 3 of those particular tags, they would score 3 points. They would then score their open water tags, and they have 4 open water tags, 1 from their upgrade area, 1 from their upgrade area, and 3 from cards in their player area. For 4 of those tags, they would score 5 points. Players would then score 5 points for each unique set of the main tags that they have, of which this player currently has 1. That's because they only have 1 each of the Vista and City tags, even though they have multiples of both the harbor and open water tags. So because of that, they would score an additional 5 points. Each player would then score their space cards. This player would score 1 point for every pair of Townsfolk and upgrade tile they have. They have 5 upgrade tiles and 3 Townsfolk cards, so they would score a total of 3 points. This player would then score an additional point for every harbor tag that they have, and since they have 4 open water tags, they've met the condition of this inspiration card, which means that they would actually score 2 points for each of these tags for a total of 6. Finally, they would score 4 additional points for their 4 open water tags in their player area. They would then score 2 additional victory points for the points printed on their upgrade tiles, and finally each player would check to see who has the majority in each of the 3 guilds. In this instance, the blue player would gain 3 additional points for their majority there, the yellow player would gain 3 additional points for their majority there, and since the players are tied, no one would get any points on the final guild. Whoever has the most victory points would be the winner, and if there's a tie, the tied player with the most black influence is the winner, and if there's still a tie, the tied player with the most yellow influence would be the winner, and if there's still a tie, the tied player with the most blue influence would be the winner. If players are tied after that, the victory would be shared. Alright everybody, that was our video. Hopefully it was helpful and hopefully it was informative. If you still have any questions about how to play the game, please comment below, or you can email me directly at thedicey@gmail.com. You can connect with us on social media or by visiting our Board Game Geek Guild as well. And as always, if you enjoy the content or you find this video useful, make sure to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to be notified whenever I put out new content. Alright, thanks so much for watching everybody. Until next time, I'll see you at the table.